My one-on-one interview with the Vice President of the United States. I talked to Mike Pence about the terror attack in Syria, plus his reaction to criticism of his wife for teaching at a Christian school. Back and forth. President Trump cancels a 7-day trip for House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, one day after she asked him to postpone the State of the Union. Ready for the big stage. Organizers are set for tomorrow's March for Life, the nation's largest rally to protest abortion. And an entirely different animal. The Vatican celebrates a saint's feast day with an unusual blessing. On EWTN News Nightly for Thursday, January 17th, 2019. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you to those of you joining us from around the world for news from a Catholic perspective. I'm Lauren Ashburn. Tonight, my one-on-one interview with Vice President Mike Pence. Earlier today, we talked about the president's constitutional duty to report on the State of the Union, but first, he responds to criticism of the Second Lady's new job at a Christian school. Mr. Vice President, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Lauren. Good to see you again.
The liberal news media, the Washington Post and other outlets like CNN, have made an issue of the fact that your wife is going back to work, and she's going back to work at a Christian school, Emmanuel Christian, that requires employees to affirm traditional religious values. It has sparked negative reaction. Does that upset you?
Well, Lauren, my wife and I have been in the public eye for quite a while. We're used to the criticism, but I have to tell you, to see major news organizations attacking Christian education is deeply offensive to us. I mean, we have a rich tradition in America of Christian education and, frankly, religious education broadly defined. We celebrate it. The freedom of religion is enshrined in the Constitution of the United States. The Constitution prohibits a religious test for holding public office, and so we'll let the critics roll off our back, but this criticism of Christian education in America should stop.
Yesterday, ISIS claimed responsibility for an attack in Syria. 4 of our Americans, 2 civilians, 2 soldiers, were killed. Today, you expressed your sympathy for the families. Yesterday, you said that we have crushed ISIS and that we've devastated its capabilities. Does yesterday's attack underscore concerns that ISIS still could pose a threat?
Lauren, let me say, after President Obama precipitously withdrew American forces from Iraq, we saw ISIS literally conjure up from the sands and overrun not just Syria, but vast areas of Iraq that the American soldier had fought and secured. In the course of our campaign, President Trump made it clear that we would crush ISIS, that we would unleash the full weight of American armed forces, pull our allies together and accomplish that. And what our soldiers have done with our coalition partners against ISIS has truly been remarkable. We've driven them not only out of Iraq, but literally taken back 99% of the territory of the ISIS caliphate. We're staying in the region. We're going to make sure we stay in the fight against ISIS, supporting the efforts from our basing in Iraq and across the region. But the president believes that if we can bring our troops home and not have them in harm's way in northern Syria, that's in the interest of the United States, and we support that. This week's tragedy is heartbreaking to every American. We grieve with the families that lost loved ones. Those families are in our prayers. The injured service members are in our prayers as well.
Let's bring it back to the United States. Speaker Pelosi has, in effect, disinvited President Trump from delivering the State of the Union because of the shutdown. What do you make of that?
The President of the United States has a constitutional duty to report on the State of the Union to the Congress. And for the Speaker of the House, who continues to refuse to even sit down and negotiate, not just an end to this partial government shutdown, but legislation that will address what is a real humanitarian and security crisis at our southern border is just unacceptable. And I think the American people see through it. What the American people want is for Democrats to come to the table. We are engaging the Democrats rank and file in the House and in the Senate.
As yesterday,
We're
you had them
looking
here.
for a way forward, and we're going to find a way to address this partial government shutdown. But Democrats need to come back to the table. That's what the American people expect.
Your critics would say there are people who are having a hard time putting food on the table. What do you say to them?
Well, first and foremost, we're incredibly proud of our federal workforce and the essential personnel that are on the job and not being paid. We're grateful for. But look, what I'd say to each and every single one of them is that this president is absolutely determined to put the security of the American people first. And so I would say to federal workers caught up in this partial government shutdown, what I would say to every American, and that is let your voice be heard. Tell the members of Congress, particularly Democrat members of Congress, that you want them to come to the table and sit down with this president and reach an agreement that not only opens the government, but addresses this humanitarian and security crisis, secures our borders once and for all.
Mr. Vice President, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Lauren. Great to be with you.
Great to be with you.
Tune in tomorrow for News Nightly for more of my conversation with Vice President Mike Pence.
Life is winning in America.
Vice President will talk to me about the Trump administration's commitment to the pro-life movement. President Trump is denying House Speaker Nancy Pelosi an aircraft for a planned trip abroad. He's flexing his executive power muscles after Pelosi's attempt to delay his State of the Union address. It's the latest tit for tat over the government shutdown. White House correspondent Mark Irons reports. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Lauren. In what looks like payback, the president cancels what he's calling Speaker Pelosi's 7-day excursion. Their spat heating up since yesterday when Pelosi tried to uninvite the president to the Capitol for his State of the Union address, citing a lack of security resources due to the shutdown. Pelosi was supposed to leave on her trip to Brussels and Afghanistan today, but the president pulled the plug. In a letter to Pelosi, the president writes, "In light of the 800,000 great American workers not receiving pay, I am sure you would agree that postponing this public relations event is totally appropriate." He goes on to say that if Speaker Pelosi would like to make the planned trip by flying commercial, that would certainly be her prerogative. Pelosi's spokesperson says the purpose of this trip was to thank U.S. troops and obtain critical national security and intelligence briefings from those on the front lines. Now, the White House says the cancellation is not in response to Pelosi's call to delay the president's State of the Union. Lauren.
White House correspondent Mark Irons on the latest between Congress and the president. Thank you, Mark. The Senate is voting on a bill that would permanently ban taxpayer funding of most abortions. The measure would make the Hyde Amendment law. It's been added to spending bills each year since 1976, but Democrats vow to do away with the protection. Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi has more. Good evening, Jason.
Good evening, Lauren. 54% of Americans oppose using taxpayer dollars for abortion. That's according to a brand new Knights of Columbus Marist poll. Democrats, now in control of the House, have their sights set on stripping long-standing pro-life protections.
This is the largest pro-reproductive health majority ever in the U.S. House of Representatives.
Democrats promised to use that majority to fight the Hyde Amendment. It's the yearly add-on to spending bills that prevents taxpayer funds from paying for abortions, except in the cases of rape, incest, or when the mother's life is at risk.
And we're going to introduce, yes, once again, the Each Woman Act. The Each Woman Act, which is the boldest pro-choice legislation in history, thanks to you, to ensure that all women, no matter their income or their zip code, can make their own decisions about their bodies. We're going to end the Hyde Amendments.
The 2016 Democratic Party platform calls for the end of Hyde, so Republicans write President Trump asking him to defend it. 49 senators and 169 House members want him to veto any bills that would get rid of pro-life policies like Hyde. And tonight, the Senate votes on whether to make it permanent.
Those people who think there's nothing wrong with abortion shouldn't force the tax dollars of people who believe it is the most fundamentally wrong thing you can do to be used for abortions.
It comes as young pro-life Americans from around the country arrive in D.C. for tomorrow's March for Life.
Jeremiah 1:5 says, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I sanctified you." To everyone who comes to the March for Life, know that we hear you and we're standing with you.
In the past, the Hyde Amendment has had bipartisan support. This bill needed 60 votes in the Senate. The vote totals just came in. It failed 48 to 47. Stay tuned to EWTN for complete coverage of the March for Life tomorrow. Lauren?
Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi, thank you. A senior North Korean official reportedly is headed to the United States to discuss a second summit. This is Pyongyang's former spy chief arriving in Beijing. He later was booked on a flight for Washington, D.C. Neither the U.S. or North Korea has announced any meetings. President Trump and North Korea's Kim Jong-un held their first summit last June in Singapore. They discussed ridding the Korean peninsula of nuclear weapons. Authorities in Austria are trying to reach dozens of Catholic nuns snowed in at their mountain monastery. But the Sisters of Bethlehem say they have enough food and fuel and want to stay put. The convent is home to 30 nuns and 1 priest. The head of the group says the roads will be cleared soon from all of the snow, and they are very grateful to remain with God. Security officials say Islamic militants have captured and kidnapped a Christian man in Egypt. Police pursued the kidnappers and killed one, but were unable to free the captive. Since 2016, terrorists have killed more than 100 Christians in the region. This week, religious freedom advocates are right here in Washington, D.C. to highlight the plight of persecuted Christians. They hope the U.S. will put more pressure on governments to support religious minorities who are often ignored. Correspondent Wyatt Goolsbee has more from the State Department. Good evening, Wyatt.
Good evening, Lauren. Christian groups are welcoming the State Department's call for people of all faiths to be able to believe according to their conscience. Advocates say that's a message that needs to be told around the world. And it's one reason why the chairman of the coalition, Save the Persecuted Christians, tells me they're stepping up their efforts and forming a new national nonprofit. And part of that includes encouraging the U.S. government to take action.
To make sure we do things like have special envoys that deal with violence against Christians around the world, to help save them where possible in places that they can be relocated where perhaps their lives may be in grave danger and their lives or the villages or the cities have been destroyed. And of course, to gather all we can, Christians all over the world, get them educated on this issue, because right now they're not educated.
Save the Persecuted Christians unveiled their official banners today, which they hope will go up in churches across the country. It comes just one day after the State Department celebrated National Religious Freedom Day. The Christian group says working at the grassroots level is key. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has announced the U.S. will host a second ministerial to advance religious freedom this July. The ministerial invites hundreds of government representatives, religious leaders, and survivors of religious persecution to come together to talk about some of the greatest challenges around the world and how they could find a solution. Lord?
Correspondent Wyatt Goolsbee reporting from the State Department. Thank you, Wyatt.
Coming up, an interview with the head of the Knights of Columbus and the final preparations for tomorrow's March for Life.
According to a new Marist poll, 75% of Americans say abortion should be limited to the first 3 months of pregnancy, and that includes 61% who identify as pro-choice. The survey also found just over half of Americans oppose any taxpayer funding of abortion, and if the Supreme Court decides to revisit Roe v. Wade, nearly half say the court should allow states to set restrictions. 16% say abortion should be outlawed. Joining me now is Carl Anderson, Supreme Knight of the Knights of Columbus, who commissioned the poll. Welcome back to our broadcast.
Thanks for inviting me. It's great.
Well, thanks for being here. What do you make of those numbers?
Well, we've seen for a decade that the overwhelming amount of Americans want restrictions on abortion. They do not agree with what the Supreme Court did in Roe v. Wade. Now, for the first time, we ask the question, when the court inevitably reviews Roe v. Wade, what do you want the court to do? Half of Americans say, give the power back to the states to restrict it. 16% say the court should just ban abortion. So that's really new and very significant.
It's 2/3 of all polled feel that way.
That's right.
There's another number that we had heard, that 3/4 of Americans say abortion should be limited to the first 3 months of pregnancy. 75% of people say at the end of 3 months, no abortions. So why isn't it the law of the land?
Well, because we don't have the right justices on the Supreme Court. Maybe we do now, and maybe we'll get even a larger majority in the next year or so. So I think those individuals, some senators who are insisting that Roe v. Wade is settled law, it's not. It's not. And so we have to continue to be firm, and the American people have the right that their voice be heard, and be heard by the Supreme Court.
I want to take a moment before we continue discussing the poll and its findings to ask about your organization, which has been in the news recently. 2 Democrat senators, Kamala Harris of California and Mazie Hirono of Hawaii, asked a judicial nominee about his membership in your group, and they said the Knights of Columbus takes extreme positions, and they asked if members who are judges could hear cases fairly and impartially. What was your reaction to that?
Well, it was very startling, and really we thought with the election of Senator John F. Kennedy as president in 1960 that those kind of questions were a thing of the past. Unfortunately, not for some senators.
Last night, the Senate unanimously passed a resolution by Senator Ben Sasse of Nebraska declaring it unconstitutional to reject a nominee for being in the Knights of Columbus. Let's take a listen.
If a senator has a problem with this resolution, you're probably in the wrong line of work, because this is what America is. This is a super basic point: no religious tests. If someone has a problem with this resolution, what other parts of the Constitution are you against?
If this person has a problem with the Constitution, what other parts don't you get? Were you surprised that this happened?
Well, here's what I was surprised about. Any senator could just say, I don't agree to unanimous consent. It's done all the time. And it would have blocked that. So not one United States senator would stand up and say, I don't want that considered unanimously. I want it sent to committee. So they couldn't even get one to oppose it. So this is very clear. And another thing, 8 out of 10 Americans say there should be no religious test, no religious consideration. And so if you can take a mainstream organization like the Knights of Columbus, which, you know, a lot of people think is
it's
like...
It's a cult. I read someone thought it was a cult.
Well, what it really...
You've never met Carl Anderson.
Well, what it really is an American Catholic cultural icon. And so a couple of years ago, a professor from Notre Dame Law School, again, another cultural icon of American Catholicism, Notre Dame University, saying the dogma lives loudly in you.
Right.
Now, here's a question that people of faith ought to be very concerned about. Do you want people coming out of Mass on Sunday or any religious house of worship asking themselves, does the dogma live too loudly in me for some government officials? Or how about our kids in CCD class? Do we want them asking that question? That's why the founders were such geniuses to say, take this off the table. No part of American life.
Thank you so much for joining us, Carl Anderson, Supreme Knight of the Knights of Columbus and a donor to our program. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Organizers are putting the final touches on tomorrow's March for Life in Washington, D.C. Here is the stage being put together, and a bipartisan group of lawmakers are going to address the crowd. So is Carl Anderson, by the way, as will pro-life supporters from around the country. The band Sidewalk Prophets also set to perform. The rally is the largest protest against abortion in the country. Stay with EWTN for live coverage of the 46th Annual March for Life beginning tomorrow at 9 a.m. We'll recap the day's events on News Nightly at 6 and 9 p.m. Eastern.
Up next, Alveda King discusses abortion and its impact on the African American community, and why the Vatican was overrun by animals.
As you heard earlier in the broadcast, tomorrow is the March for Life here in Washington, D.C. Monday, the nation will celebrate Martin Luther King Jr. Day in honor of the late civil rights leader. Our next guest has close ties to both of those events. Joining us now, Alveda King, Director of Civil Rights for the Unborn for Priests for Life, the niece of civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. Welcome back to our broadcast.
Hello, Lauren. How are you?
I'm good. I'm very good today. I'm so happy you're here. You have long argued that abortion is about racial discrimination. The Guttmacher Institute reports that African American women have the highest abortion rate, 27 in 1,000, right here on the screen, as opposed to 10 out of 1,000 white women. Why or how are African American women targeted for abortion?
Abortion, Lauren, like slavery, is a crime against humanity. So we know that slavery is a sin, slavery is wrong, sex trafficking, for example. But somehow the script was flipped. And so it became a civil right to abort a child. It became a woman's reproductive right. But nobody really examined the motives behind it, because the founder of Planned Parenthood, Margaret Sanger, said that colored people are like weeds. They need to be exterminated. Let's not let the word get out. So they came up with a plan to sell an idea to women, and black women especially, that it was a reproductive right to decide whether you would birth a child or not.
Would your uncle, what would he say about this?
My uncle, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., I like to say Reverend. You can see I smile when I say that. He and my dad, Reverend A.D. King brothers, were preachers, and their daddy, Daddy King, was a preacher. So A.D., M.L., and Daddy King. So Martin Luther King Jr., in a Christmas sermon, said, when you value the human personality, you won't kill anybody. And I first heard that read by Father Frank Pavone, National Director of Priests for Life. Yeah, and he uses that all the time. And my uncle really cared about every human being.
The Trump administration has advocated pro-life policies, but there's a new Congress in town, and the president of Planned Parenthood was at the Capitol meeting with lawmakers this week. What do you see as the biggest pro-life legislative battles that we are going to face?
We must recognize that abortion is a sin. It is a crime against humanity. Congress needs to acknowledge that that's not just a lump of flesh in the womb. That's not just a blob of tissue in the womb. That's a human being. And so that's an innocent human being. And if the child was conceived in America and being born in America, an innocent American whose rights are being violated. I don't know how Congress can overlook that fact, but we'll see what happens.
Alveda King, Director of Civil Rights for the Unborn for Priests for Life. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
The Pope is preparing to attend next week's World Youth Day in Panama. An EWTN team member will be there, and he has advice for others making the trip.
I would say to look towards Mary and the call to servanthood. That's really this year's theme. It's the looking towards saying yes to the Lord. And so I would say that it's an opportunity for all the young people that are going to be going to kind of reconnect with their prayer life and to go to Panama with a open spirit of encounter.
Benjamin Crockett will be traveling to Panama with EWTN's social media team. The Holy Father will depart Wednesday from Rome. And finally tonight, the Vatican went to the animals today.
Questi animali ci siano di aiuto e sollievo delle nostre necessità.
That's Cardinal Angelo Camastri giving a blessing on the Feast of St. Anthony of Egypt. There they are, and the animals on hand included sheep, cow, donkeys, and even geese. St. Anthony is the patron saint of animals and farmers. For all of us here at EWTN News Nightly, to all of you around the world, thank you for watching. I'm Lauren Ashburn. Let's keep in touch online. Follow me at Lauren Ashburn on Twitter and at Lauren Ashburn EWTN on Facebook, where you can see more of my interview with the Vice President. Good night, and God bless you.